Geoff's children's sermon hit especially close to home this morning because there are times when I will say or do things and my wife says, "You've lost your marbles." So there it is. Today's first scripture reading is taken from the 8th chapter of Mark, verses 27 to 30. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him.
I will continue to read from the 8th chapter of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, 31 through 38. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father."
May God bless the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of these words this morning. We continue in the Gospel of Mark with the 2 readings that we heard this morning that help us continue our journey with Christ as he makes his way to the cross. For we are now a part of this crowd, the crowd where he speaks to later in our readings. And at this point in the Gospel of Mark, our author is starting to slow down the timeline for us. As I spoke earlier when we started Mark, this is a very fast book in the Bible. It goes very quickly. And so a little trivia for you right now. The first 10 chapters of Mark cover around 3 years of Jesus' life. The last 6 cover 1 week. And so we are coming to the end of these 10 chapters of Mark, so we're starting to slow down a little bit. And our first reading is one that we probably all know really well. It's one that we can probably recite. If someone was standing here and asked you, who did Peter say Jesus was? Most of us will probably say, "Oh, the Messiah." Yeah, we know that. We've heard this before. And that's great. And it's wonderful. We understand this scripture. And what's even better about it is now, after around 3 years, Peter is finally understanding what's going on. Peter finally gets it. For Jesus asked him, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Messiah." 3 years it took this man to understand this. 3 years of not really getting everything that had been going on. But Peter finally understands. He doesn't have to pretend anymore. He gets it. He has seen 3 years. of Jesus. Healing, feeding, standing up for others, performing miracles, reaching out to those who are different, who are on the outside, bringing them in. 3 years of Jesus talking about the love of God. 3 years. And now, everything is put into perspective. Peter gets it. He understands. He is following this man, Jesus. This is now a role model that Peter can get behind. This is someone that Peter can love, Peter can follow. This is our Messiah. This is who we come to hear about each and every day. This is our role model. We can follow this person, the healer, the feeder, the acceptor. We can follow him no matter what. It's all clear. Everything is great. Peter understands. He knows. And that lasts about 2 verses. Because in our second reading, Peter falls back. He falls back into the old way. He doesn't understand what Jesus is telling him. He doesn't understand why Jesus is saying it. And of course, he's going to speak up. And he has words for Jesus. He pulls him aside and he rebukes him. Now, it might be the case that Peter doesn't understand what's going on. Or it might be the case that Peter understands exactly what Jesus is trying to tell him, but Peter does not want to hear it. Peter now hears that following Jesus might lead to death, might lead to suffering, to pain, and this is not what Peter wants to hear at all. So he rebukes Jesus. But Jesus is not going to have any of this whatsoever. All of a sudden, this Jesus, the one who is taking his message all the way to the cross, this is no longer a path that Peter wants to follow. This is no longer the role that Peter wants to emulate. We really don't know exactly what Peter said to Jesus. We can infer because of what the Scripture tells us. We can infer that because the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be killed, Peter probably didn't want to hear that. Probably didn't want to follow that role model. Didn't want to take that journey with Christ. And for all of these troubles, Peter rebukes, and then Jesus looks at him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Whew, it's pretty rough. But it has meaning. Because what this does in reference to Satan, this takes us back to when Jesus was tempted for 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. Now Mark, God bless him, skipped over it in 2 verses, just like that. So we don't really know what happens. But in the book of Matthew, Matthew goes into great detail and tells us everything that we need to know. Because it was during this time that Satan was trying to get Jesus to use his powers, his messiahship, to make things easier on himself. To use the power that God gave him to make his life easier. Satan was trying to get Jesus to rule over everything with all that God has given him. Trying to show Jesus that the easy way was the right way. Trying to deceive Jesus into thinking what his messiahship should be instead of what Jesus knew his messiahship was going to be. And this is what Peter is trying to do this morning. Because according to Geoff M. Bassler, he says, Peter seems to have assumed that Jesus' messiahship would follow the more traditional expectations. Kingship, might, and victory. This is the Messiah that Peter wanted to follow. And we know because we are told in the second Psalms of what a Messiah is going to be. For we read, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell you the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. That's the Messiah that Peter wanted. He can follow that one. Peter's Messiah was a ruler, one who was to control over everything, one who had the power, the glory, and everything else that came with it. Peter's Messiah is someone who expects God to give them everything that they want, who asks and then waits, doing nothing themselves. Just sitting back, watching what God does for them just because of who they think they are. And Jesus at this point is now telling Peter that this is not the Messiah that he is going to be. Because Peter was associating righteousness with power and privilege. He held on to the thought that the Messiah's agenda, he held on to the thought what he wanted the Messiah's agenda to be, and not what the agenda actually was. Not the agenda that Jesus had told them time and time again, but the one that he wanted it to be. He was beautifying everything that needed to be done. He was placing his own desires onto Jesus, turning his desires in his mind into Jesus' own desires. There are times when we do this. And at times, this is how we see Jesus. As the one who will bring us things, whether we do anything or not. This is the Messiah that we want. This is the Messiah that talks to us. Honor, glory, financial prosperity are not indicators of being blessed or of being righteous. Following Christ, doing the will of God is what gives righteousness to the people in God's world. We are here to set our minds on divine things like Christ, not on human things like Peter. Peter was setting his mind on those human things, and this is not what Jesus is asking us to do. Jesus is asking us and telling us something completely and utterly different. At this point in our scripture, Jesus now turns to the crowd. He invites them in with the disciples. Jesus is now speaking directly to us. We don't have to spy on this conversation. He is speaking to us, letting us know what we are supposed to do with our lives. And in Mark 8, verse 34, we read, He called the crowds with his disciples and said to them, if any of you want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Notice the words that Jesus is using here. He did not say, if any of you want to be my disciples, but instead, he said, if you want to become my followers. The literal translation of the word disciple is student. Students can learn from their teachers, but not follow what they are taught. They can hear everything that is told to them. They can recite it back word for word and then turn away from everything they have learned and do something completely different. but followers. Followers are those who listen and then do what they are told. They walk in the footsteps of those who are teaching them. They act upon the world. And now Christ is asking us to be followers, to follow in what He is doing, to listen, to hear, to understand, and then to do. Now, the stakes are being raised. Suddenly, to be a follower of Christ, to be a true disciple, is more than being a watcher. It's more than being someone who tells others about the glory and the grace of Christ. It takes action. It takes going out into the world and doing something. And at times, it might even take your life. And this is where we kind of get lost. And this is where we kind of stop, we back up, because we value our life. We don't always want to run headstrong into something that could possibly cause us suffering. And so we start to change things a little bit. I invite you right now, look around the sanctuary. Look at everything in this building. Look and find the crosses. Look at all the crosses that we have in our worship space. How do they look? They are bronze, perhaps gold. They are in stained glass. They are lit up. They are well maintained. They are pretty. They are clean. They are smooth. And they look beautiful. And this church has taken great pride in making sure that they look beautiful. Because this is how we want to see the cross. Pretty, nice, clean. This is our cross. However, this is not the cross of Jesus Christ. We have turned these crosses into jewelry. We have turned them into decorations. We have turned the cross into tattoos. And that's okay. If you have these, it's fine. Because it reminds you. It shows you of where you are, who you are. But the problem is we have made these crosses small. We have made these crosses lightweight. We have made these crosses so we can put them in our pockets, so we can hide them under our clothes, so that other people can't see that we have them with us. We are hiding our cross. This is not the cross that Jesus is talking about. These are not the crosses that we are being asked to take up, to carry, to go out into the world and to follow Christ. The crosses that Jesus were talking about were heavy. They were wood. They were large. They were instruments of intimidation, torture, pain, and death. They were things we don't like to talk about. There are things we don't want to pick up. And so we make them pretty. And we forget what they were. If you were able to take up the crosses that Jesus was talking about, people would know. You can't hide those crosses. We would have to then put ourselves into the world, open ourselves to whatever may come, to actually be followers of Christ as we go out into the world. Jesus took up his cross and he carried it everywhere he went. He took it up for every injustice that he saw, for all the times when people were being treated differently, for the times when people were not accepted, the times where people were being shunned, the times of violence and hatred in this world. Jesus carried his cross. And he spoke out. This is the heavy cross we are being asked to carry. When we see these things we know because we have the book, things we know that Christ and God would not approve of. Bigotry, hatred, injustice, segregation, everything that does not equal love in this world. We are called to take up our cross and to follow in the footsteps of Christ and to let everyone know that that is not right. To let everyone know who we are, followers of Christ, not just disciples, not just students, but followers of Christ. We've got to decide not to hide ourselves. We can't hide ourselves in our own thoughts, in our homes, in this church, but we must go out. We must speak out, no matter what the consequences might bring. We have the words of Christ. We have the actions of Christ, and we must not be ashamed of what they tell us. They tell us that love is the greatest commandment, and they don't give stipulations past that. They tell us to turn the other cheek. They tell us to love our enemy. They tell us that if we are ashamed of that teaching, then Jesus Christ will be ashamed of us when we meet him again with God. Following in the footsteps of Christ, carrying the cross is not the easy way, but it is our way. We are the ones who should not be ashamed that we do follow Christ. Not hear, not just recite the words, but follow what Christ has to say for us. The cross that we carry is not small. The cross that we carry cannot be put into our pockets. It is not pretty. It is not polished. It is large. It is heavy. It is hurtful. But we still carry it because that is who we are. Thomas B. Slater tells us, true discipleship is defined not what one might receive, but by what one is willing to give. Are you willing to carry your cross and possibly give to others what Christ was willing to give for you? Let us end this morning taking up our cross, giving ourselves to others in love, in justice, in peace, and in the words and the deeds that Christ taught us. Because we are not ashamed of who we follow. We are not ashamed of what we believe. We are not ashamed to go out into this world to show God's love to everyone. We are not ashamed to be called Christians, to be called followers of Christ. So let's go out into this world and let's prove it to everyone. Amen.
darkness be over me, my rest a stone. Then in my dreams I'd be